Welcome to our group SPMA 2P06 presentation on the National Basketball Association's anti-doping policy and its application. My name is Ryan Bader, and the rest of our group is as follows: Aman, Bedi, Niko, Barron, Ben, Bairos, and Zack, Baldino.
So today we will be talking about what is the NBA's anti-doping policy, organizational information in correlation to the policy, the key definitions, background information of the policy. We're going to be explaining about some of the common violations, the disciplinary conduct for policy violations, the objectives the anti-doping policy aims to achieve, real-life examples, the collective bargaining agreement influence, impact on the league, policy statements, the doping control process, anti-doping education, and as well as review questions after. Alright, so the context behind the NBA's anti-doping policy. It establishes, regulates, and enforces their rules against substance use in the league. One of these ways of doing that is implementing drug tests on NBA players. It prohibits the use of drugs such as cocaine, methamphetamines, marijuana, performance-enhancing drugs such as steroids, masking agents, and diuretics. And it also establishes the penalties and punishments that are given to those in the league who violate the policy's code of conduct. And so examples are suspensions, fines, disqualifications, etc. These of the league are influenced by their operations in accordance to the anti-doping policy. The rule of fair play is promoted through their anti-doping policy. The NBA establishes a sense of authority to the organization through the anti-doping policy by strictly operating according to that code of conduct and by giving penalties and punishments to those who violated it, which shows that any violation of their policies will not be tolerated. It also develops a public positive brand image through the misappropriation of substance abuse among their athletes, which is in accordance with their anti-doping policy.
Article 3 of the current collective bargaining agreement established between the National Basketball Association and the National Basketball Players Association outlines many key terms that correlate to the main focus of this presentation. The medical director is essentially the individual who is chosen by the NBA and the NBPA that has a previously successful track record in relation to testing and treating substance abuse. The director is also responsible for selecting and managing the counselors and various other key personnel that are required in order to implement the drugs of abuse program. The independent expert is the person selected by the NBA and Players Association who is required to have substantial industry experience in the field of substance abuse detection and enforcement to regulate conduct. Counselors are individuals specifically selected by the medical director to provide counseling, support systems, and other treatments to players in the anti-drug program. Authorization for testing occurs when there is a notice issued by the independent expert that denotes that there is reasonable cause to believe that a respective player is engaged in the use, possession, or distribution of a limited substance. Coming forward voluntarily is a term that means that a player has directly communicated to the medical director and wishes to enter the program and seek treatment/rehabilitation for a problem involving the use of a drug of abuse or marijuana. Drugs of abuse shall mean any of the substances listed as drugs of abuse on Exhibit I-2 of the collective bargaining agreement. Just to list a couple would be steroids, related hormones, stimulants, cocaine, or masking agents. And the drugs of abuse program shall mean that both the testing program for drugs of abuse and the education, treatment, and counseling program established by the medical director, the NBA, and the NBAPA.
Alright, so we're going to be looking at the policy background information. This policy was first implemented in 1983, and it was the first policy of its kind included in the NBA's collective bargaining agreement. This policy is predicated on eliminating drug use in the NBA, along with ensuring that players who use drugs are provided with the treatment necessary to help overcome substance abuse. This is the first league to fully acknowledge and attempt to implement policies that deal with players and their drug issues. So there's a three-strike system in place, and these incidents carry increasingly harsh consequences. So if a player voluntarily comes forth with a drug problem, his team will pay for his rehabilitation program and there'll be no loss of salary. If he comes forth a second time, a player will be suspended without pay and enter a treatment program. And lastly, if a player has a third bout with drugs, he'll be banned from the league for 2 seasons and will be able to apply for reinstatement after those 2 seasons. The initial goals of the policy were to limit the number of players using drugs and to provide the proper care for those suffering from substance abuse.
All right, so next up we have common policy violations, and there are three ways mainly in which players do violate these policies. And first off would be PED usage, and we've seen the rise of anabolic steroids such as THD, which is a cream that players use, as well as the HGH, human growth hormone. And second off, we have stimulant usage, and that would be in terms of marijuana or cocaine. And we've seen players like Matt Barnes come out and say that he's been smoking before NBA games, for example. And third but not last, we have masking agents or diuretic usage. And basically what that is to do is urinate faster so that you can get rid of all the drugs that are already in your system. And one example of that would be most recently DeAndre Ayton in the NBA. All right, so next up we have the disciplinary conduct for policy infractions. And what that means basically is the NBA needs to ensure fair play so that the players are ordered to strive fairly. And what it basically is to do is punish for any non-compliant behavior of the policy. And there are some kind of suspensions for that. For example, the 10-game suspension would be after a first positive test, and unfortunately unpaid. Secondly would be a 25-game suspension, which would be after the second test, and unpaid as well. Thirdly would be the 1-season suspension, which would be after the third test and unpaid. And lastly, but not least, the minimum 2-year suspension, and after the 4th test, unpaid, and unfortunately no association with the NBA. All right, so next up we have the anti-doping policy and its objectives. And why it was first initially implemented was because of the rise of PED usage in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, with athletes, for example, such as Ben Johnson and Barry Bonds. And what it was basically implemented to do was establish some kind of universal understanding of fair play and fair competition. And it's also to establish some kind of clear guidelines for players to follow, right? If we can't understand the guidelines off of word to word, there needs to be some kind of written consent. And last but not least, it needs to be in there to discipline or penalize any individual wrongdoings of the players or any non-compliant behavior.
So some real-life examples of how this policy has been implemented go back to its early stages, way back in 1983. The three players who were notably affected are John Drew, John Lucas, and Michael Ray Richardson. John Drew played for the Utah Jazz, John Lucas played for the Houston Rockets, and Michael Ray Richardson played for the New Jersey Nets. Each of these players reached strike 2. Utah waived Drew because there was a drug clause in his contract. John Lucas retired, and it was said that Michael Ray Richardson ended up staying clean after this. Now, if we're looking into some modern examples, Tyreek Evans is one that jumps to mind. He's the only player in our era that has been banned from the NBA for 2 seasons. He's eligible for reinstatement in 2021, and it was said that he had a long list of drugs in his system, including cocaine, meth, LSD, heroin, and others. So he was definitely impacted heavily. And one of the most recent examples, former first overall pick, DeAndre Ayton, had tested positive for diuretics, which led to a 25-game suspension, which was the first of his career. So now we're going to touch on the influence of the collective bargaining agreement. The most important thing that this does is create guidelines. The original policy that was implemented in 1983 has laid the foundation for the current policy. The 3-strike system has remained the same to this day. Also, importantly, it enforces sanctions on players and executives. The CBA is the document that the league looks to in order to impose these sanctions, so it's really important to have it clearly described for everyone to follow. The CBA puts into writing the sanctions for using these banned substances and is the most important policy document when touching on this subject. The biggest impact that the CBA has is creating a mutually understood set of rules that are simple to follow and that clearly outline the steps in place to prevent the use of drugs and also outline the steps in place to help those suffering from substance abuse.
Performance-enhancing drug usage in the NBA may be disregarded when it comes to the scandals of other major North American sports leagues such as the National Football League or Major League Baseball. However, doping still remains a massive threat to the National Basketball Association's overall integrity, among numerous other things. Doping ruins the esteemed reputation of NBA basketball and effectively tarnishes the organization's brand, which actively promotes fair play and competition at the highest level. Further, players may be provoked to start utilizing these limited substances, in order to stay ahead of the unfair advantage that is created by them in the first place. The NBA has entrenched statements found in Section 11 and Section 2 of their CBA in an attempt to limit the chances of any new doping scandals arising. Section 11 focuses on the league investigative protocol for any alleged player misconduct that requires complete cooperation with both sides. On the other hand, Section 2 focuses on confidentiality, an extremely important aspect of the investigative process that guarantees anonymity in regards to the diagnosis, treatment, and results for any players that are found to be in the anti-doping program.
So next up we have the doping control process. The NBA and the Players Association have formed a prohibited substance committee, which is comprised of one representative from the NBA, one from the Players Association, as well as 3 individuals who are experts in the field of testing. These members meet annually, once during the off-season and once during the season, and the committee's purpose is to review the program's list of prohibited substances, the anti-doping issues, as well as any potential modifications to their current policies. To continue with the doping control process, the NBA will test every player at random between 0 to 4 times a year. These tests may occur at practices or games, but will never happen during the off-season. If scheduled on a game day, any blood testing will be done after the game. And for the urine test of a visiting team, these tests will occur prior to the shoot-around. And if any test isn't complete by the time a team's bus or way of transportation must leave the arena, then they'll provide him with alternate transport, as well as a team staff member to complete the testing process. Every player is eligible for these tests, though not everyone will be tested in a single season. It's fact that rookies are more likely to be tested than veterans due to the fact that they're new to the league and don't have any prior history, and as well that these veterans have played multiple years and have history. All tests conducted are analyzed by laboratories selected by the NBA and the Players Association and are certified by WADA. Next, we have anti-doping education. So the World Anti-Doping Agency provides many different tools and information to assist their stakeholders with their own educational programs, as well as help educate target groups. WADA has created toolkits of activities customized for coaches, teachers, program officers, and sport physicians to help provide any information about anti-doping. The activities created to provide anti-doping information to fight against doping in sport include some like Parents Guide to Sport Clean Sport, as well as the Dangers of Doping leaflet, as well as many more.
Here are 5 review questions our group discussed to challenge whoever may be listening to this presentation. Pat Reed, that means you. Question number 1. What is the purpose of the NBA's anti-doping policy? Question number 2. What year was policy information implemented? Question number 3. How does the NBA deal with players who infringe upon the NBA's anti-drug policy? Question number 4. Which NBA player is a recent example of the policy being implemented? And finally, question number 5. How many times a year does the NBA test a player as part of the doping control process?